Welcome to Season 2 of Classical Education, a podcast for those who believe in rediscovering the art of asking questions, engaging in conversation, and attending to the ideas at the heart of well-ordered teaching and learning. Adrian Fries and Trey Bailey invite you to join them on a journey in pursuit of the true, the good, and the beautiful, as we participate in the great conversation and listen to the many voices coming from the world of classical education. Well, this is our special Halloween episode, and Trey and I are very excited about this episode where we've decided to talk to two experts on Dracula and Frankenstein. So for myself, I had never read either of these books, and to prepare for the podcast, I ended up listening to the audiobook Frankenstein, and I loved it. And I am halfway through Dracula. Dracula's been a little bit challenging for me. It's harder to follow. They're both extremely well written. I've been very surprised, but Dracula is super scary. I'm like halfway through. I'm in the middle of chapter 13, and we may have some spoilers on this episode. Just heads up if you haven't read them yet. But I'm anxiously getting through Dracula. I have had a hard time putting it down today because Lucy just died. So I'm like, oh, what's going to happen? And they're talking about cutting her heart out or something. So I'm in this real cliffhanger moment right now. So, but I'm excited to introduce Dax and Melissa. And Trey, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say that I haven't even read Dracula yet, so I have no idea what you're talking about. But believe it or not, I didn't read Frankenstein until graduate school, if you can believe that.
And well, I know I'm 52 and I had just read it. So you're ahead of me. That's okay.
Well, I mean, I had heard of, of course, we all know that Albert Einstein was a genius scientist. I just didn't realize that his brother Frank was such a monster.
Oh, God, that's right. There's your bad dad joke there.
Yeah, I've got one more. I just have to get out of the way because I have seen the Bram Stoker film that was made some years ago. I watched that in graduate school too, but I haven't read the book yet. But I did hear that Dracula sucks.
Yeah,
all right, I'm done.
You've been following that TikTok channel of dad jokes with the guys sitting on the pier there, haven't you?
Yeah, my husband actually watches that. Oh, this is great. I've never watched either films. I've never watched Frankenstein or Dracula, and I presume that reading both of the books, I'm not going to like the movies very well, which is your typical, the books are always better than the movie, but maybe you guys can give some better recommendations. So we're going to start off. I would like you both to tell your stories and how you got introduced to these monsters and what sparked your interest to dive deeper into their stories. I'm going to start with Melissa. I'd like you to give us some background on yourself with this, and then also on Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, and maybe why there's two versions of the story.
Sure. Thanks so much. I'm so happy to be talking with you all today. Well, similarly, I did not read Frankenstein or Dracula in high school or even in college. I did. I was, into the goth scene, and so I did dress in black and go see Bram Stoker's Dracula in the theater, and was very excited about that. The Winona Ryder and Keanu Reeves fan, but hadn't read the books. I had the pleasure of receiving a teaching fellowship at Rutgers University in New Jersey, and in that fellowship, I was able to create writing classes for freshmen, and the director of the writing program there wanted us to construct writing courses that were like literature courses, so we could put it all around a theme. So it wasn't your typical English 101 where you would work straight out of just one textbook. We would do a theme. And so one of the themes that I did one fall was the grotesque in literature and art. And so we looked at Frankenstein and Dracula and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and then a couple of Edgar Allan Poe stories as well. So, which is fun. It's a great fall theme. So that was my introduction. Reading it before I taught taught it to a bunch of freshmen while I was in grad school.
Tell us a little bit about what you know about Mary Shelley and why there are two versions of this story.
Yes. Well, so the two versions, you have the 1818 version and the 1831 version. The letters are different. I think maybe we're going to talk a little bit later about how this is. It's an epistolary novel, and that's the main way that Shelley drives the story, drives the narrative. And so a number of the changes that are made in those two editions are through those letters. There's a guy named Edward F. James who has a blog who lists these out very carefully, and there's also a lot of kind of argument about why the changes were made, whether they were just made, to improve the story, because we also know that the impetus for the story was this kind of dare or contest to write ghost stories from Lord Byron, from this group of friends who were all writing. And Mary Shelley, along with her husband and Lord Byron, created this story. And she notoriously was just not quite sure of her ability to come up with a story. And she was very stressed every night when they would talk about their progress with the story. She never had anything to contribute. She said that she claimed that she always gave kind of a mortified no, that she didn't have anything to share yet. And then she came up with a story very quickly, kind of based on a dream one evening. And so the result, the early version, the 1818 edition, is that story as it was developed initially. So years later, 1831, a lot of people say that it has a lot to do with the difficulty, or the tragedies actually that happened in her life. And is it okay if I just read somebody's kind of synopsis of it? This is from Anne Miller. She reckons that Mary Shelley's philosophical views changed radically, primarily as a result of the pessimism created by her own personal circumstances and the deaths of those close to her. She had met Percy Shelley very early, when she was 16, and they actually didn't get married right away because Percy was already married, and it wasn't until after his wife committed suicide that they were able to marry. And then she had a daughter, and then she had another child, and and both of these children died. And then she suffered a nervous breakdown, and then she had a miscarriage, and then Percy Shelley drowned. So that all of that happened, between the 1818 version and the 1831 version. So I imagine, much like if you pick up a book that you read, 13 years ago, you might feel a little bit differently, about it.
Wow. Yeah, she had such a tragic life. That's interesting. The version I read was the newer one. I didn't even realize there was an original until I was almost finished reading. Now I want to go back and read the first version and compare the two. Could you tell our listeners what an epistolary novel is?
Yeah, it is my favorite kind of novel. It's a novel in which, we read St. Paul's epistles, they're letters. And so an epistolary novel is what we refer to as a story through which the narrative is delivered to the reader via reading somebody else's letters or journals. And it's really, I mean, it was really popular in Victorian literature, um, because it's almost this kind of voyeuristic way of receiving a story. And so I don't know if you've ever maybe taken a, history of the novel class. Um, this is always a really, it's a shift in the way novels were constructed. And it's just so much fun, because it's an easy way for the author to shift perspectives.
Mhm.
So without, I guess maybe without the work of, doing an omniscient, limited, narrator. So for a while, when you first start reading Frankenstein, you are reading Victor Frankenstein's letters, and throughout you go back and forth his letters to his sister, and also, I mean, I'll let Dax talk about this, but the uh, Bram Stoker's Dracula is also epistolary.
Mhm.
Um, Trey, do you
While
have
we're
something?
talking about while we're talking about the various versions, Melissa, I'm wondering if you're familiar with the lost ending of Frankenstein. I actually happen to have a copy of it right here in front of me. So yeah, this was lost for a long time. It's just now recently been uncovered thanks to the work of I forget who, but I'll just read it to you. It says, "As he drifted away, I could just make out his final words. It's okay if you just call me Frankenstein instead of Frankenstein's monster. I really don't mind." The end. Just great scholarship there. Whoever pulled that together. But that is something that Frankenstein is so widely read, especially in high school anymore, and I find it fascinating. Dax, I'd be interested to know when you first read it, or if you've even read it yet. I don't know if there was just a period of time where it was sort of not in the classroom, and now I feel like it's in a lot of high school classrooms. But as a result, it's likely that it's probably taught poorly, because it's and maybe I'm just making an assumption there, but I do know in my own experience of teaching Frankenstein, um, there are some places where if the students just happen to venture online and start reading things that they find on the internet, they'll bring certain things to the classroom that I feel like oftentimes don't make for a very good reading of the story. And I can give you my opinion on that, but I just wonder if, as someone who has taught this, it sounds like at the college level, what are some of the ways in which Frankenstein is commonly misread?
Well, let's see. The ways that it's commonly misread. That's a good question. I think it's probably I well, Adrian, I think, can probably speak to this. I don't know if anyone knows what they're getting into when they start reading it. Um, it's not, and I guess I can also say this from having taught it in like a Gothic or grotesque art and literature class. It's not scary.
Right.
You know, it's a very tender story. Um, it's a story of loss, it's a story of ambition, it's a story of creating things and wondering about the limits of what humans can and should create. Um, so I think probably the way it can be mistaught is that it is some early kind of bastion of scientific progress,
Mhm.
and it's not. It really is kind of questioning, hey, should humans be doing this, and how are we responsible for what we create? And that's why I think you have these really beautiful illusions, and if we can start teaching it in the classical high school classroom, the allusions to things like Paradise Lost,
Yeah.
where when the monster tells his story, when he learns to speak, which is also, you know, one of the beautiful things about the story is, what does it mean to be human? When does one become human? Does the acquiring of language separate us from something dead and something alive, or something that has a soul? So it's all questioning, what does it mean to have a soul? When are we actually alive? When are we just, pieces of flesh and bones stitched together? And when can we feel? When can we cry? And when can we really be hurt, to the core, that we become evil? I, I don't ever hear it talked about in those ways.
I think you're right, Melissa. And I would love to see a teacher in a classical school teaching it, because, that I felt like it was very much a book about what it means to be a human being, for sure, very much. And how do we respond to things or people we're not comfortable with, people we're afraid of, or even how we respond to something that we've created. It was really good. I really enjoyed Frankenstein an awful lot. I do want to get over to, we're going to talk more about Frankenstein, but I want to get over to Dax and have him give some background on his circumstances in which Frankenstein was developed, and how there are connections to Dracula, as well as his background with being an expert in Dracula and vampire things.
Sure. Well, two of you know my mother, and my mom is very much into horror, and has always been. And she loves to tell people that she raised my brother and I on Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist, and that we turned out okay. I actually have no recollection of watching those when I was a kid, but I do remember watching a lot of Dracula movies. The Frank Langella Dracula was always on in my house, which came out in 1979. Obviously, when Bram Stoker's Dracula came out in '92, we saw that one several times, and it's still a favorite. So I grew up with that a lot. And then in the movie The Lost Boys, which came out in 1987, which is a kind of a pivotal year in my life for many reasons, but that movie kind of sparked the interest for me. But it was just always in the background. And I had like one or two books. My brother gave me a book once on vampires because he knew I liked them and things like that. And then I think it was 2010, I did a lecture on music, because I teach music sometimes at the college level. And I did a lecture about music, and they asked me to come back in the fall, and this is at my own college, says, could you do another lecture? And I said, well, since it's October and Twilight had just come out, maybe the first movie had come out, so why don't we do something about, like, how did we get from Dracula to Twilight, with vampires? And so I did that lecture, and it was really popular, and I did it 3 more times within the next year or so. And then I started developing other lectures, and then people said, you should record these or make videos. And I said, well, I've gotten into podcasts recently, so I was like, maybe I'll do it as a podcast. And so I went to meet with a professor at Baylor who writes a book that's called The Vampire Book. You can find it in almost any bookstore. And turns out he has like this huge collection of books. He has 800 editions of Dracula in his collection, including a first edition. And he gave me just a bunch of books. So I went from having like 2 books to hundreds over this course of a couple of years, and doing my own podcast, and doing a lot of research into Dracula and the novel, the historical character, all the films. I've written an article or 2 about the films, and all the different actors that have played it. Dracula is the most filmed character, or the second most filmed character of all time. The most filmed non-human character. Sherlock Holmes is the most filmed character, literary character, and Dracula's number 2.
Wow.
And there is at least one movie with both of them in it at some point in history. Now, I'm not saying they're all good movies. I mean, we're talking 200 plus appearances of both in film, or on screen. But so I got into kind of Dracula more over the past few years, doing a lot of research, talking to different people. I hosted a conference a couple of years ago for the 120th anniversary of the publishing of the novel, where Bram Stoker's great-grandnephew was our guest speaker, and several other scholars from around Texas that were there. And so I've just kind of been in that world now for several years, with the novel and the films. But to talk a little bit about the background, kind of how Frankenstein relates in a way. So Melissa talked a little bit already about, Mary Shelley and writing Frankenstein during this little contest that they had. The background of that contest is really interesting. In 1815, April of 1815, there was a volcano in Indonesia, Mount Tambora, that erupted, and it was such a major eruption that it changed the climate of the entire planet for over a year. And this affected Europe quite a bit. And it was called, 1816 was called the year without a summer, because like the entire European landscape was basically covered in clouds and rain. And so this summer that Byron, Percy Shelley, Mary Shelley's cousin, I think, or friend, I think it was her cousin, who was another young girl. And then Byron's doctor, Dr. John Polidori, his personal doctor, spent this summer in this house on Lake Geneva in Switzerland. And the weather was so bad that they couldn't go outside. And that's kind of how they came up with this contest. And there's several movies that kind of cover this summer. There's one with Gabriel Byrne as Byron and Julian Sands as Shelley. I just met Julian Sands recently at a convention, and we talked a little bit about it. He was excited that somebody had seen that movie, and we talked a little bit about it. But it talks a little bit about how they did this. So part of that contest, besides Mary Shelley's writing Frankenstein, is that Byron himself started a story. And we actually still call it today a fragment. It's a fragment of a vampire tale. It wasn't complete. His doctor, Polidori, took that idea and he wrote his own story, published the same year as Frankenstein. It's about a 40-page short story called The Vampire, with this lead character named Lord Ribbon, who is basically Byron. He basically just turned Byron into a vampire. And it's really the first idea of this romantic vampire, this romantic style Victorian vampire that we have in writing, especially in English. It's considered to be the first vampire story in English. And both of those, both Frankenstein and the Vampire, were turned into plays very quickly, not just in England, but in France as well. I believe there's a French version of Frankenstein pretty soon after that, and the Vampire also. And Byron had to fight quite a bit to convince people that he didn't write this short story, because he says, this isn't my style, I didn't write this. But Byron has another poem, the Grimoire, that does talk about a vampire, and it's very interesting that this vampire dies while serving in a war in Greece, which is exactly how Byron died later. So there's all this connection there. And then Bram Stoker, in addition to being an author, he was a theater manager. That's what he did. So he would have been quite familiar with these plays before he wrote this. So we went from Polidori's Vampire to the next English story being a Penny Dreadful serial called Varney the Vampire, which, if you put all of the versions together, all of the stories, there's over 800 pages there of these Penny Dreadfuls. And then Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, who is also an Irish author, and then Dracula in 1897. And so they have all of these kind of things that build up to it, all based on that summer that Polidori and Shelley, began these stories. But since he was a theater manager, he worked for Henry Irving, the famous actor, and ran his theater in London, that he would have been quite familiar with these plays. But they are very different, because Stoker spent 7 years writing Dracula, and it's a heavily researched novel, as opposed to Shelley's, who's came to this idea that comes from a dream, and she wrote it very quickly. Stoker spent a very long time writing this, and there's tons and tons of books of notes and versions and all these different things. And there are other versions of Dracula. They've recently been discovered an Icelandic version. We knew it existed because the 1901 version of Dracula has a new foreword by Stoker, and it says this is the foreword to the Icelandic version also. But the Icelandic version was just now translated into English after 100 years, and it's quite a different book. And the question is, did Stoker change it, or did the Icelandic newspaper that ran it as a serial change it? But then it turns out there's also a Swedish version that was made around the same time, and that possibly the Icelandic version may have been translated from the Swedish version. So there's all this really confusing kind of stuff with which version is which. But the basic novel never changed in English, at least. Just the preface to the 1901 version makes this claim that wasn't in the original version, which is that this is a true story.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, which ties to this question. First of all, are the stories true? And like, how true are monsters? But why did he have to do research if it's fiction?
So Stoker's research involved a lot of things, and there's a couple of main sources. I mean, the claim that it's true is obviously not. I don't think anybody considers it that true. Although Stoker's great grandnephew just wrote a prequel to Dracula. He wrote a sequel, and now he's written a prequel. And in that prequel, I believe the idea is that Stoker was he was very sick as a child. This is true. Till he was bedridden until the age of 7. And he had a miraculous recovery. And this novel fictionalizes that I think it was a vampire who cured him, and so he knew that vampires were real. And so when he writes Dracula, it's as a warning to everybody else. But his research involved a couple of things. One was a book about Transylvanian superstitions, written by an English woman whose husband was a diplomat, and they had spent time in Transylvania. She wrote about these superstitions. He also found one source that talked a little bit about Dracula, the historic person. And this is one of the major issues in Dracula scholarship is, did Bram Stoker know anything about Vlad the Impaler or not? In 1970, there was a documentary and a book made called In Search of Dracula, where these two scholars connected the two, and it was the first time they'd really been connected. After that, we've found his notes, and we know that according to his notes, all he ever wrote down about Vlad the Impaler is that he existed, that he was a prince from Transylvania and Wallachia, and that he fought the Turks. And that's all Stoker knew.
Mm-hmm.
And the main thing, that Dracula means son of the devil. And that's in Bram Stoker's notes. And Dracula was originally called Count Wampir.
Huh.
For 5.5 years of writing it, it was Count Wampir. And once he read this source, you can see in his notes, he went through and he crossed out Wampir in all of his notes and wrote the word Dracula. So really, as much as we know is that he liked the name and that he fought the Turks. So in the novel, the only mentioning of Vlad the Impaler at all is that this allusion to the fact that there was a Dracula who fought the Turks. Dracula himself gives this little speech to Jonathan Harker that his ancestors, have been in that land for hundreds of years, and they fought the Turks, and that's basically it. So we know these sources that he used and did research with. We have notes of which vampire characteristics he pulled from some sources and which ones he made up himself, things like that. And it's a lot of notes and a lot of research. And those notes are here in America, in Philadelphia, at the Rosenbach Museum. You can go and see them. And they're published also in a book. So, yeah.
Melissa, do you want to add some thoughts?
Yeah. I wanted to mention what Dax just did when I lived in Philadelphia for a while, and in the fall they put at the Rosenbach Museum, which is a really neat collection. There were two brothers who had one collected furniture and the other collected books, and they put Bram Stoker's notes on display. And I guess one of them that I remember seeing has the characteristics of a vampire that he's writing out. So you actually see, that he puts down, when he's brainstorming, that a vampire would not be able to see his own reflection in a mirror. It's just neat to see that there was this process. And then also, Dax, I had a question for you when you were talking about the different iterations of Dracula, especially with the first that first story being published at the same time as Frankenstein, why do you think that there were so many? Why do you think that people were drawn to Dracula as something to, you know, rewrite and rework
Mhm.
so often at that time, and not, you know, not with Frankenstein?
Well, I think it's the fact that those stories that came in between, so the vampire in English, and it wasn't like this in other languages. Vampire stories in other languages were not necessarily very romantic, but the English ones are all portrayed as these, handsome men, and they're very romantic stories in many ways. Dracula itself, actually, film has done it a disservice. The only real Dracula film that shows Dracula in all of its forms is the Bram Stoker, is the Coppola version. Um, Dracula starts the book as an old man, his hair all over the place, and all these crazy things, long fingernails, and he gets younger as the book goes on in appearance, and that's usually not. I mean, Bela Lugosi didn't change, and most of the time they don't change. So there's not a lot of occurrences of that, but that's all of those stories. Carmilla, even though it's a female vampire, is still very much a romance. Um, so they were, I think, as opposed to Frankenstein's monster, who's not really the romantic type.
Except that he
He
wants a
try
wife.
he
All he
tries
wants
to
is a wife.
Yeah,
he,
that's true.
he tries to be, but I don't think others don't see him that way. So it's but
Oh,
also we have a good saying that vampires, um, they change with time, and they're a reflection of like modern society's insecurities in a way, and what they would rather be or look for. Obviously, eternal life is something that many people sometimes wish they could have, although I'm sure if they had it they would regret it at some point. But
oh,
you know
that's interesting. The idea of eternal life kind of, I think that theme is really in both of the books, right? I mean,
Certainly.
yeah. Well, I mean, in Frankenstein, it's there because he's wanting to create a life that he can have immortality. Wasn't that one of the reasons he was experimenting?
Yes, and it's something that the monster is, I think, upset about. And it's one of the reasons that he wants to have a mate, and it's one of the things that he does lament. Dax, like you're saying, it ends up being a monstrosity that he's not necessarily going to have a natural end to
Mm-hmm.
things.
Mm-hmm. Tell me what is monstrous about both of these characters, and really, Frankenstein is not the monster. Well, or is he? I mean, if you haven't read Frankenstein yet, the monster is just he doesn't even have a name, right? Yeah. So, so what's monstrous about these characters? How do we define monsters?
it's interesting because Dracula definitely has a bigger murder count than Frankenstein's monster. I mean, really, the monster in Frankenstein, he's not really as violent as people have made him out to be. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
unless you watch the what they call the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which came out after Bram Stoker's Dracula. The main disturbing scene in that is when he beheads the Victor Frankenstein's fiance. But there's not a lot as much. Dracula himself though is constantly. I mean, one of the very first scenes of where you understand that he is a vampire, where Jonathan Harker understands he's a vampire, is Dracula is bringing a baby back as food for his brides, right? So that's the pretty monstrous
I,
already.
I
And
think, yeah, I think when, if we talk about what's monstrous, um, the thing with both of these, neither of them are really horrific by today's standards. It's not Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist, but what's monstrous, in my opinion, is that both of these stories start with something very recognizable. And I think that's what's so unsettling about these stories, is that you recognize the setting, and it all is, it all seems possible until it doesn't. And I think that's kind of what great science fiction does. You know, it takes something as it is right now, and then it spins it out to its most absurd and, you know, and thus monstrous end. In Frankenstein's case, you know, the creation that Victor ends up bringing about all of the things that he's afraid of. And so, you know, maybe what's monstrous there is that we can't engineer something that is going to help us escape from our own choices or our own responsibilities. Um, you know, because I guess that's kind of the commentary going on in Frankenstein. Dax, you can talk about Dracula, but I think that's really the monster in the stories. You know, are both. It's everything seems okay until it's all gone. You know, Harry Carey.
You know, and Dracula, which one of the things that's very different is Dracula is definitely a supernatural story as opposed to where Frankenstein is scientific in many ways. Dracula, the novel itself doesn't ever explain how he became a vampire. That's not in the novel. It's added in movies. You know, the whole first section of Coppola's movie is not in the book. Yeah. So all of this, the ways he becomes a vampire, we just don't know. There's a little bit of a mention of dealing with magic at the Skull of Mons, which is this school in the mountains of Transylvania or whatever. But there's this idea of supernatural, you know, this immortal being that can turn into a dog, into a bat, into mist, into a wolf, and change his age. You know, and all these things is quite, you know, scary. And the idea that this comes from, you know, London is this modern place in the novel, and they go to this, you know, way out, very superstitious region of Eastern Europe, and this thing comes from there to London, and that's kind of Dracula's whole thing. He wants to, you know, he's done everything he can. He's eaten all the people he can in Transylvania, and they know about him, and you know, they even warn, you know, Jonathan Harker very first thing in the book. So he's like, no, I need to go somewhere else, and I mean, but he does it in a very practical way. He knows, at least he does it properly, and he legally buys a castle in London and all these things, or an abbey. And so it's this idea that there's this kind of supernatural being, but there's other, you know, monstrous and horror things. You know, Adrian, you were mentioning where you were in the book, and not to spoil what happens next, but I will anyway. What the characters have to do after Lucy dies is monstrous in itself, and a horror to them. They have to. She's died once. Now they have to go kill her again, and that's one of my favorite scenes out of the Coppola movies. After this has happened, Van Helsing is having Anthony Hopkins. They're having dinner, and Mina says, "Did Lucy suffer?" And he says, "Yeah, she suffered." And he's like, "We cut off her head. We staked her in the heart, and then she suffered a lot." You know, it's just the way he says this delivery is kind of amusing, but it's this idea that they had to do all that, you know, and they have to turn into the monsters in some way, but they had to do it because Lucy is a monster, and she's out there killing children, you know, once she dies. And it's all these ideas of things that the love story in Dracula that's in the movies is not in the book.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
The Dracula Mina love story is not in the book. She actually kind of detests what's happening to her, even though he is still trying to make her one of his new brides. But it's not the Gary Oldman Winona Ryder love story that we have in Coppola's film, or even as it's portrayed in many stories, many Dracula films. It's alluded to, but it's not a love story in any way in the original novel. But Dracula's interesting because, you know, what happened is that the book was never registered, never copyrighted in the United States, at least, and not really in England very well. So it's been in the public domain since it was written. and anybody can do anything with it they want. The only time it's ever been fought was with the movie Nosferatu. Bram Stoker's wife sued W.F. Murnau, and because it was basically Nosferatu, the movie is Dracula. So he, even though he changed the names and the setting, she still won, and it was ordered that the movie be destroyed, but 2 copies survived, and we still have Nosferatu in the world because of that. But that's the only time the copyright was ever really enforced, but it was never copyrighted outside of Europe. So it's been in the public domain, which is why I have 60 different printed versions of Dracula, because anybody can print it. We could print one and publish it today if we want. There's no copyright. So
Interesting. Trey, do you have any questions?
Well, I've just really enjoyed listening in on the conversation here. And Dax, you mentioned something earlier in your comments about how Dracula was written as a warning.
Mhm.
And I think there's a key there, because that word monster, that's what it means. A monster is a warning. And so we could think about any story that has a monster in it. And of course, the question becomes is, okay, well, what then is the warning, right? What is this story trying to warn us about? And I'm reminded of, a monster that goes to a pretty early story within Beowulf. You have Grendel the monster. And there's an interesting word there that's used to describe Grendel as a Mirkastapa. In other words, this person who kind of walks the border between the world of monsters and the world of men, or the world of light and the world of shadows. And one can only imagine what would happen to you if you drew close to that border, and even if you crossed over it. Some translations of that word is someone who crosses the border, goes back and forth over this border. And of course, when we think about fairy tales, when we think about that border that sort of delineates the village and the dark wood, right? I mean, we can all see it in our mind's eye, because even just looking at it, it clearly, the darkness of the wood sort of is a warning in and of itself. And yet we populate the wood with monsters. This is something that parents have done for a long time. Why? Because there's a warning there. And so I just wonder if maybe we could think about the idea of warning. And what do you think the warning is? I'm sure there are multiple warnings within Frankenstein. And what is the warning for us within Dracula?
Well, Trey, I think this can go back to your earlier question about some of the ways in which these stories can be mistaught or not properly thought about if we're having them in a classroom. Yes, there are these warnings about wandering too far outside of your community and wandering too far outside of your purpose as a human. Humans are, this is what humans do, this is what humans do not do. But I thought of one way that I have seen Frankenstein taught and Dracula is this idea of the other, really popular way of taking a story and deciding that whatever, monstrous, protagonist there is, we're going to kind of make that person the hero and the other. And then we start needing to figure out why everybody was so terrible to Frankenstein. Everybody just needed to be nice to him, and everybody was afraid of him because he was different. And it's not just because he was different. Like, there were some definite markers that something was not okay with this creation. Anyway, I just wanted to note that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. And Dax, I want to let you jump in here, but it seems to me that, and I'm open for conversation on this, but I feel like a very common way of misteaching Frankenstein is for the teacher to try to persuade the students to think that if they were Victor, they would have loved the monster, right? And I think that's just missing the point. But I'm happy to have a dialogue about it. Dax.
So when Bram Stoker kind of mentioned this idea of him saying the Dracula is a warning, is with this fictional idea was that it was an actual warning against vampires existing. That this happened, and We know some of the other things that we know about, by the time the 1901 version came out, when he wrote this second preface, the Jack the Ripper murders had occurred. He had been in America after Stoker came to America in the 1890s while he was writing Dracula, and also encountered news articles about Mercy Brown, which is a very famous American vampire story. There was this vampire craze in New England in the late 1800s, early up to 1900, which was basically a bunch of tuberculosis cases that were just misunderstood. But Mercy Brown made the news because her sister and her mother died of tuberculosis. Her brother got tuberculosis. She died from it, and then she was dug up. Her heart was burned, and the ashes were fed to her brother as in a tea. And then, of course, he died from tuberculosis also.
Oh my goodness!
But this was a very common thing that occurred in, especially in Europe. I mean, most vampire folklore is based on two things: a misunderstanding of disease, and then a misunderstanding of decomposition, and then superstition. But this was happening even here in America. Mercy Brown was in Rhode Island, and her grave is a very popular Halloween thing to visit. But Stoker saw these articles when he was in America. She died in 1892, and he was visiting. So he knew that people were still believing these things in various places, right? And so he kind of sets us up as I think it's partly a warning to those who think it's real that it could be real, but also a warning to not believe in superstition. Not to let superstition overtake modern thought in a way, but and also just against evil. Dracula is an evil character, and again, he's not always portrayed that way in movies. Gary Oldman's version of Dracula is a very sympathetic character because of all the backstory about his wife dying and all this stuff. But it's not how it's usually portrayed in the novel. It's very different. And he's an evil that they have to, these good Christian men have to defeat this evil, the devil basically incarnate. So it's this warning of real evil in the world, whether you could take the supernatural parts out and he's just a murderer, like Jack the Ripper, obviously that has to be stopped. By the good. So it's a real good versus evil basic story. It's just the films always kind of misconstrue that. I think
so he didn't stab the cross until it bled.
No, the Coppola version adds in again the whole backstory. They're taking the Vlad the Impaler stories and combining them. Coppola does that quite a bit. The most for those who are interested in films, of all the versions of Dracula, the one that's the most faithful to the novel is a BBC version from the 1970s starring Louis Jourdan. It was a TV movie, and that one follows the novel, still not completely, but the most of any other version.
Interesting. Well, that doesn't surprise me. BBC does a pretty good job on a lot of.
They did another one though in the 90s, which is not good. So.
Well, I think the most faithful version of Frankenstein is what starred Gene Wilder, right?
There you go.
That's right. And my favorite Dracula is Dracula Dead and Loving It, which is Mel Brooks and Leslie Nielsen. So.
What's it called?
Dracula Dead and Loving It. Leslie Nielsen is Dracula. It's great.
Oh my!
We need to have a double feature.
Yes.
They're both Mel Brooks movies. So, the Leslie Nielsen encapsulates all the different Dracula films because it was made after Coppola. So there are times where he's channeling Bela Lugosi and times where he's doing Gary Oldman and all these different things. And it's just it's a great movie.
So it sounds like the Mel Gibson version would be more enjoyed if you've watched some of the other versions first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mel Brooks, not Mel Gibson.
I meant Mel Brooks.
That'd be a totally another movie.
Yeah. Yeah, sorry. I did mean I wrote down
Yeah.
Mel Brooks when you said it.
Yeah.
Well, I want to talk a little bit about teachers in high school and college, like teaching these books, since we're a classical ed podcast. Would you recommend that high schoolers read these books? We do know that some classical schools and public schools are reading Frankenstein. But what about Dracula? What ages would you
Mhm.
suggest for these? And Dax, how old were you when you read Dracula?
So I read an abridged, like, children's version of Dracula probably when I was about 12, and I was uh, just listening to another interview I did recently, where I think the version that I read, I don't even think was in epistolary form. I think it was like a children's narrative version of Dracula. Um, and so I read that one when I was 12. I didn't read the full novel again until um, maybe like 10 years ago, actually, when I read it again. My version of Dracula that I've had my whole life is the leather-bound version that has Frankenstein and Dracula in one book. Frankenstein I was supposed to read in 11th grade, and I wasn't much of a reader back then, so I got around it, but but that's when it was assigned for me. I have a 10th grader this year, and she's going to be reading Dracula in the spring. I know, so.
And she goes to a
And
classical
that's
school.
a classical school.
Yeah.
But Dracula in schools, I've never seen. In college, I have, obviously, but in schools. But I think 11th or 12th grade is probably a good age for Dracula. I mean, it does. We've talked a little bit, and you've talked about how some of it seems to be pretty scary still.
It is, yeah.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute, because before we can maybe pinpoint who and when people should be reading this, maybe we need to make a defense for why they should be read at all. Especially, I can imagine someone who is, let's say, a concerned parent thinking, well, why do we need to be bringing these things into our imagination? This idea of horror means to, make you shudder, or to make your hair stand up, to give you goose flesh, as some people say. Is that good for us? And if so, why?
Well, I mean, I think that, a solid argument for having Frankenstein in the classroom, even in, probably ninth grade, it's part of the great conversation. Its other title is The Modern Prometheus. And, in classical education, we're teaching them the myths at very early age, Greek, Roman, Norse myths. And so, I think it's a very natural way to, probably by the time they're in ninth grade, maybe they have encountered the myth of Prometheus a few times, hopefully. And at that point, they're able to say, okay, what's going on here? How is this called the modern Prometheus? What does it mean to be modern? Because they've probably gone through that cycle of, maybe modern times, the ancient, medieval, and modern times. So how is this modern? Who's the Prometheus? What's the punishment? And making those parallels. But then there's also, they have the allusions to Adam and Eve, and so if they've been reading the Bible, at least Milton's Adam and Eve, and then that introduces them to the crossover between types of texts. We have this epistolary novel that's telling a story. She's brought in all of this poetry. Why did she do that? Was it just because she loved those poems? Did she have particular access to those poems? I mean, she was hanging out with a bunch of poets. But it's rich. It is just part of the great conversation. So I think for sure it needs to be in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
I think Dracula is an interesting one. Its best quality is probably that it is this telling of the big fight between good and evil, and the good actually does prevail in the end. Sorry, spoiler. Dracula doesn't kill everybody, just a lot of people. So it's this idea that good can triumph over evil, and also, even just for the basic fact that these two books together make up the two greatest examples of Gothic, literature, and just even for historical value, it's quite an important work. It's this year marks the 125th anniversary of its publishing, and again, it's such a Dracula is such an important part of the still of popular culture and just all culture, so much that there are a lot of places where they even just call vampires Dracula. All vampires, all soft. I'm from Tennessee. All soft drinks are Coke, and in that way, all vampires are Dracula.
Right.
Whether they are or not, or they follow that at all. So it's such an important part that I think sometimes going to the source to find out what that really is can be beneficial, because again, if you're basing it solely on movies, and right now I've always had this theory that every generation has a Dracula on film. Whether it was Bela Lugosi, and then it was Christopher Lee, and then it was maybe Frank Langella, then it was Gary Oldman. This generation hasn't really had one yet. They've tried a few, but the Netflix series is the most recent one, the Netflix Dracula, and it takes so many liberties with a lot of things. The first episode is great, the second episode is okay, and the third episode is just weird. And it's but he does a good job. The actor does a good job, but it's something that people have seen so many different versions of. To get the real story at some point in their life is a good thing, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think
Yeah.
maybe just to tack onto that, Dax, you mentioned this kind of, synecdoche of Dracula is, always the vampire, and we will refer to Frankenstein as, any given monster. Everybody generally knows what these things are, and so I think for young people to know actually the source, because they're going to encounter references to Frankenstein and Dracula from very, very early ages. I mean, they're going to eat the cereal. But to be able to know, what the actual story is, that also gives them the opportunity to make their own connections as they go along, as they, we've only talked about a couple of the texts that are referenced in Frankenstein. There are a lot, and that's a joy. At least, for me, that was a real, I guess, key to really enjoying literature, is finding those little, Easter eggs when you had learned a text and seeing where they popped up in other places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we could definitely make a very strong argument concerning, a need to pass on a common knowledge and a shared culture. And of course, we ought not forget that there's that warning to pass on as well. And we all know from experience that cautionary tales usually don't work, but they're good to reflect back on and probably lead you to repentance. Like you say, okay, I see what I've fallen into or what our society has fallen into. And I have to say, in terms of Frankenstein, I haven't really thought through this related to Dracula yet, but if young people are not equipped with this story, then they might miss some of the warnings that are going on right in front of them, some of the monstrosities that our society is promoting.
Yeah.
If you don't think people aren't interested in tacking on a variety of different body parts onto themselves and creating them, forming themselves in whatever image they think they can fashion themselves in, then you just haven't read any of the recent headlines. And so, here we have a story that continue to warns us, and that way, we need to pass it on.
Yeah.
I want to kick it back over to Adrian here, but at some point, Adrian, don't let me forget, I want to share a story about how Victor Frankenstein and Thomas Aquinas are connected. So don't let me forget that.
Okay, I'll try not to. Well, no, I think that's a great point. The warning. I really Frankenstein really made me think a lot about internally myself. Like, how would I respond to somebody who looked like this? None of us want to think that we would respond in that way. And the whole time that that Frankenstein, the monster actually, is planning to try to befriend this little family in the cottage. you develop this really deep sympathy for him, and you're like, oh, if he came to my house, I would love him. But then when you see how he planned it out so well, he, revealed himself to the blind grandfather and hoped that the grandfather could convince the young woman and man that he was a good person. And it still didn't work because when they saw him, they immediately wanted him out. But
Well, and that
it made
sorry,
me
go ahead.
cry. It made me cry. I felt sorry for him. I mean, it was clear that he was developing a very tender heart from learning what humans ought to be like. And then when he saw their unloving side, it made him more monstrous. And so it was very interesting to me. It gave me a lot of self-reflection of how would I respond to somebody.
Well, and I think it's important though there to uh, not be too hard on the family, because they're not. Um, I don't think it's so much the way he looked that was horrifying, right? I mean, he's not a human. He
Right.
is. He is a thing that humans have created that is not the same as what God creates. And I think it's the family sensing that, it's
Interesting.
not it's not just that he was ugly. I have a feeling that, people would have seen ugly, marred, frightening looking people before. Right? I think that repulsion that humans feel towards the monster is this weird kind of something's not right here with this being,
Interesting.
you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah. But it really did make me self-reflect quite a bit.
Yeah.
And I felt pretty angry with his creator for not being merciful to him.
I think Thomas Aquinas would have killed him. You want me to tell that story?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. All right. So, having read this book in graduate school, one is tasked with the responsibility of then having something profound to say about it in a paper. And so, I was looking into it and doing a lot of digging and following a lot of footnotes, and I came across this story of. Well, before I tell that, the first thing I stumbled upon is in the text of Frankenstein itself. And I'm going to try to remember this correctly. It may be in the university library, but I'm 99.9% sure it was in his father's library. Victor was reading a smattering of different authors, but one of the things he was reading at home was the work of Albert the Great, or Saint Albertus Magnus. Okay. Now, listeners may recall that this fellow was the teacher of Thomas Aquinas. And so this is how the Victor and Aquinas are related. So having both, let's say, for the sake of the argument, studied under this master, of course, they ended up going and ending up in two radically different places, we could say, because there is a legend that is connected to Saint Albertus Magnus that he created. Some people call it a robot or some sort of automaton. And in some versions, it's just the head, and it could talk, and it could actually give counsel and give you all sorts of information, prophecies, that sort of thing. And in other versions, he created a full body. Now, depending on your reading of these various stories, some people think that it was made of metal, and other people think that it was some sort of combination of metal and flesh. So you see the interesting connection there with Frankenstein, of course. And I just wonder. I don't know how familiar Shelley was with this story, but of course it's like this little Easter egg that you were talking about. That's right there in the story. Here you have this brief mention of Victor reading Albertus Magnus. Well, as the legend goes, Thomas Aquinas came into his master's study, and this creature spoke to him, said, "Salve, salve," and he beat it with a stick and destroyed it. And I think in some versions he even burned it. And of course, if you want to know more about this, there's a professor over at Mount let me get this correct, Mount St. Mary's University. His name is Christopher Andalay, I think. Anyway, he has a YouTube series. I think it's a 3 or 4 part series called St. Thomas Aquinas and the Robot. And if you're someone who enjoys following rabbit trails and footnotes, in this multi-part series, he just, through his reading, kind of gets down to what he thinks is sort of the origins of the story. And there's a text that was written sort of in defense of people who had been accused of magic, where St. Albert's name is sort of cleared, and that all of this was in fact really just sort of these really early inventions of like robotics, and that maybe through some use of wind and the sun warming the components inside, this robot was able to make a sound. But of course, as legends go on, a lot of people came to believe that he had in fact created this life of sorts, not unlike a Victor's monster.
Interesting.
Yeah, there's a paper to be written there. Isn't there? Is there? That's from a Norse myth. Doesn't somebody have a head that gives them wisdom? And I'd be interested to see, if somebody probably has already written about the head that gives wisdom to the leader. I know I've seen that in a number of.
I think there are several different, interestingly, from cultures all over the world. So there's something that, and this goes back to our conversation about monsters in general, something that both repels us and attracts us, this desire to, whether it's have the ability to create life or to generate life or master life. And of course, a lot of people have made the connection that, the Jurassic Park story is just sort of a retelling of the Frankenstein story.
Well, we actually do need to end here because I know Melissa and Dax both have to probably get back to work. But Dax, you mentioned you have a podcast. What is your podcast?
It's called The Vampire Historian.
Okay.
The very first episode I ever did was about Dracula, but I'm hopefully going to be re-releasing that first episode because I don't like it, but it's that's what it's about. And
well,
and
we will
several others. But.
We'll put a note in our show
Sure.
our show notes as well for sure.
It's great.
Well, thank you guys for having us on, and coming on our show, and we really think this was great. I think our listeners are going to love it.
Thank you so much. This was so much fun.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much for listening. We invite you to experience the art of teaching through interactive learning communities at our Patreon page. Visit patreon.com/classical education. Also, be sure to join the conversation on our Facebook community at facebook.com/groups/classical education. We are a listener-supported podcast, so your support makes this podcast possible. As the great artist and educator John Ruskin once wrote, "Well, my friends, the final result of the education I want you to give your children will be, in a few words, this. They will know what it is to see the sky. They will know what it is to breathe it. And they will know, best of all, what it is to behave under it, as in the presence of a Father who is in heaven."